Please, please, have some more. Isn't that one of the most common refrains when Jewish people host you for a meal? So is Hachnasas Orchim all about the food? And if it is, how do you do Hachnasas Orchim with Malachim? The Rambam tells us in Halacha, that welcoming and hosting guests is greater than receiving the Shechina. How do you know? Because the pasuk in our parasha tells us that Avram Avinu looked up Vayeira and he saw Shloisha Anoshim, and there were three men who obviously were malachim in disguise standing over there. Strange choice of pasuk, don't you think, to prove to us how important it is to host guests? The fact that the Rambam only quotes these four words. It doesn't even allude to the rest of the story by saying etc. Is mashma that implies as the raya is von differ verta that the Rambam believes these four words teach us everything that we need to know about how important it is to host, even over superseding the greeting the Shechina. Says nicht move on. That's very unusual because we are so learned from Vayeira in Shleisha Anoshim as gdei lachnas where in those words do you see that it is greater to host guests than it is to host the Shechina? What makes it even more surprising, the origin of the Rambam's comment is from the Gemara Shabbos, which says, and in der Gemara, there the Gemara says the same thing, but bases it on a different pasuk in the story, which is same words, that it's greater to host guests than to host the Shechina. As the pasuk says, Vayeira, and Avram Avinu said, if it suits you, if it finds favor in your eyes, please don't leave, because I'm going to welcome in these guests. And Rashi touched up, as Rashi on the pasuk says, Al Nosaver means that what happened at that moment is the Avram Avinu, so to speak, left the Eibishter and went to invite his guests. So that tells you three things actually. Number one, the Rambam is Meshana from the Raya Gemara. The Rambam quotes a different pasuk as the proof to what the Gemara chose. Secondly, from Araya, the Rambam chooses a quote rather than the one that is very simple and understood. And instead chooses a proof which is difficult to see as a proof. Thirdly, this is in contrast to how the Rambam normally conducts himself, which is if the Rambam is going to quote a pasuk not quoted in the Gemara, it's because the pasuk he's choosing is clearer, easier to understand. Here, he's leaving the pasuk the Gemara quotes and giving us one which is more difficult to understand. So clearly, somehow, the Rambam sees in those words that he saw the three men. That tells us everything we have to know about the importance of Hachnasas Orchim. Now, this proof, which is that he saw three men, and therefore we know that it's greater to host. So the first attempted answer we're going to give is, the Rambam says, the fact that he noticed the three men already tells you how important Hachnasas Orchim is. Because think of the context. What's Avram Avinu doing? In whose presence is he? Who's he speaking to? This is a scenario where the Eibush does appear to him. How is it possible that Avram Avinu should be able to notice three other people? Not only notice them, but to pay attention to them. To the extent that he detects that they are strangers and therefore runs to invite them in. When you're standing in front of the Eibishter, you're not allowed to do anything. It shouldn't enter your mind to do anything else. Certainly you shouldn't put your attention elsewhere. So I mentioned to suddenly focus on people or anything else for that matter. Over Mikolsha came from Krishma, and this is speaking face to face to the Eibishter. How much more so when you consider the halacha of Krishma, which is when you say Shema, it has to be with focus and with trepidation and with awe and with shaking and with perspiration. Which, by the way, it says Be'ima over Yira, and then it says Be'reses over Zeya, because Ema and Yira are soul experiences, they're feelings, whereas Reses and Zeya, trembling and perspiration, are physical experiences. Why? Why should you be in such a heavy state? Because you're reading the decree, the writings of the king to his people. And every single time that you daven, every single time you read this, should be brand new in your experience. It's like you're standing at Har Sinai. Likewise, we have protocols about how we're supposed to daven the Shemona Esrei. A person should consider himself as if he is face to face with the Shekhinah. Person has to feel as if they were standing in front of the King of all Kings, Hashem. Und der Din is, as a tonit mafsik sein fakein shum zach. So as a result, when you daven Shemona Esrei, you're not allowed to interrupt for anything at all. Even stories in the Gemara about Roman noblemen getting upset with the sages, the Chazal, not stopping the Shemona Esrei. And you have to stand like a servant in front of the master, on kein shum tnuos, without any gestures, ein lazim min kaimen, not to move. Now that's when you're davening, where you have to imagine that you're face to face with Hashem. Now consider, Avraham Avinu is literally face to face with Hashem. Vayeira Hashem. He's speaking to the Eibishter. He's engaged with the Eibishter. How can he look away? How can he notice anything else? How can he give them attention? It's not something written. It's not something that he has to imagine. No Vayeira Elav Vayem Mamish. The Eibishter appeared. How's it possible that in that context Avraham Avinu should notice the Malachim disguised as humans? Not only does he see them, but he deals with them, he responds to them. Maybe that's the whole point the Rambam wants to make. Therefore, surely that alone proves to us that it is greater to host guests than even to host the Eibishter, because look, you can look away from the Eibishter to take care of your guests, or even potential guests. Seeing as the Eibishter, who is currently engaged with Avraham Avinu, is the one who says that hosting guests trumps being face to face with the Eibishter. That's why, while in this Yechidus with the Eibishter, Avraham Avinu pauses and he goes to find his guests. So maybe that's the whole point the Rambam is making. The only thing is, that does not answer the question, which is, okay, so that could be good proof to the fact that hosting guests is that important that it even overrides your one-on-one with Hashem. But there's a Gemara, and the Gemara quoted a different pasuk to illustrate the point. Why did the Rambam not take the pasuk the Gemara offered? The pshitas derived from Vayeira bin Shleisha Anoshim is nit mavur yoser v'derived from Gemara. Because obviously, even though we've now explained how you could extrapolate out of the fact that he notices the guests, that shows us that Achnasas Orchim is greater than receiving the Shekhinah, but it's certainly not as clear and obvious as the example that the Gemara brought, but to the contrary. So our question remains, why does the Rambam not just simply use the same pasuk as the Gemara? So let's try another explanation. Perhaps the answer lies in the whole debate as to who Avraham Avinu was talking about when he said, hold on, I'm going. The Gemara Shavuos tells us, as the concept that welcoming guests is greater than welcoming the Shekhinah is built into another debate between the Tanoim. If every time the Eibishter's name is used in Avraham Avinu's context, it's always actually referring to the Eibishter. So that we know, right? Generally, we say that every time that the name of Hashem is used, it's Kodesh. There's one debated piece, which is the moment where, in our reading, Avraham Avinu says to the Eibishter, Hashem, please don't go anywhere because I'm going to greet these guests. Is he actually speaking to Hashem at that point? Or is it that he's speaking to masters? He's speaking to the guests and saying, hey, don't go anywhere, please come join me. According to that view, that it's not a holy name, then Adnai al-No-Savor is not actually Hashem's name, he's referring to the Malachim. Especially when you consider that Rashi includes both opinions in his commentary. Okay, so with that debate in mind, let's plug back into the Rambam. That could be why the Rambam did not want to use the same pasuk the Gemara used, which is that Avraham Avinu said Adnai al-No-Savor as his proof that Achnasas Orchim overrides seeing the Shekhinah. Because not everybody agrees that that's what happened at that point. Especially when you consider that the Rambam in Moreh Nevuchim, although that's not a halacha sefer, it's still an opinion that the Rambam obviously holds, says at that point that Avram was speaking to the Malach. So therefore it's not clear that from here that Avram Avinu is saying to the Eibishter, wait because I'm going to invite guests, and therefore that's maybe not the best proof that inviting guests overrides hosting the Shekhinah. Okay, sounds like a good answer, except it's a good answer until you look at what the Rambam himself says in this book, in the Yad HaChazakah. From Besifra Yad Paskin the Rambam Beferosh, the Rambam tells us clearly, and this is halacha in the Sefer Yad HaChazakah, Kol Hashem Esamurim B'Avram Kodesh, that every time Hashem's name is used in a conversation around Avram Avinu, it's referring to the Eibishter, and it's a holy name. Including this one, where he says to the Eibishter, wait, because I'm going to invite the guests. So therefore, you can't tell me that the reason the Rambam did not want to use that pasuk is because it's uncertain if he's actually speaking to Hashem. The Rambam rules that he is speaking to Hashem. Okay, let's try another option based on something else that the Rambam says in Moreh Nevuchim. In Moreh Nevuchim is the Rambam Vayeira. The Rambam has a very radical perspective in Moreh Nevuchim where he says that the whole story never happened in real life. As the vision of three men, the fact that Avram Avinu welcomed them, gave them food, they promised him a son, all of that is a prophetic vision. It says, continuing from the fact that the Eibishter appeared to Avram Avinu, and in that apparition, all of these things happened. It wasn't physical. Which might then give us the answer that we're looking for. That would explain why the Rambam believes that the part where Avram Avinu says to the Eibishter, please wait because I need to invite guests, doesn't actually tell us about Achnas Tzorchim. Why? Because if you go with the Rambam's Shita in Moreh Nevuchim, that's not an interaction that happened in real life. Is a tale from them. Even the moment where Avram Avinu interacts with the Eibishter to say, please wait so I can invite the guests, is part of the prophetic vision. It's not something Avram Avinu actually did. And seeing as we want to prove that you actually are supposed to invite guests, even at the cost of hosting the Shekhinah, you need a story of where somebody actually did that, and apparently Avram Avinu didn't. So that might be your answer, except that answer is fundamentally flawed. Because you could say the same thing about the pasuk that he saw the three men, and that's what the Rambam uses as his basis to tell us how important Achnas Tzorchim is the Pirusha b'Moreh Nevuchim. According to Moreh Nevuchim, that was also part of the prophetic vision. It also never happened in practice, if you're going with that approach. And then there's no advantage to the one pasuk over the other pasuk because it's all part of a prophetic vision. And how can it possibly tell us about the action of hosting guests superseding the experience of hosting the Shekhinah? Now, if you're going to push the envelope and say, well, the truth is, even a prophetic vision can teach us a lesson, or at least give us the context that Hachnas Tzorchim is so important. The very fact that the Eibishter chose to give this kind of a prophetic vision, and because of how the Eibishter constructed or choreographed this prophetic vision, was partly also to tell us the advantage of hosting guests over the Shekhinah, is Tochaderabba. That's not going to work logically. To the contrary. Because if you're going that route and you're saying bring a pasuk out of the prophetic vision to illustrate the importance of Achnas Tzorchim, you're back to square one. The better pasuk is the pasuk that says Avram told Eibishter, wait. Even if that's part of the prophetic vision, it's still a better pasuk. As a pasuk Vayeira of Vayeira is the klal von a pasuk Vayeira in Shlesh Anoshim Nitzavim hebt zechon the Pirat HaNevuah von Vayeira of Vayeira. So the way that the Rambam explains it in Moreh Nevuchim is that the pasuk that says that the Eibishter appeared to Avram Avinu is, in a sense, the overarching umbrella of everything that's about to happen, and everything that's about to happen is the details of that prophecy. And using the Rambam's words, the Torah now unpacks exactly what it is that Avram Avinu saw, including the fact that in that a prophetic experience, he saw these three men. Olafize. Is given whichever way you cut it, in Moreh HaNevuchim, seeing the three men is considered a prophetic experience, not an actual human and physical experience. Then there is nothing about that actually illustrates the advantage of hosting guests over hosting the Shechina. Because what's the logic to say that hosting a guest is greater than hosting the Shechina? Because you pause the Shechina to deal with a guest. But if the whole thing is part of a prophecy, nothing gets paused. Nor the Vayeira v'hine goyim doskuf is dinevu Vayeira elav Hashem. It's the same experience. Vayeira elav Hashem is the Shechina in His presence. Vayeira v'nishloisha anoshim is part of the detail of the Shechina in His presence. Hakbolas pnei Shechina. It's part of receiving the Shechina. How does it illustrate that hosting guests supersedes that? Whereas the content of the words of the pasuk in the vision of prophecy that says, Avram tells the Eibishter, please don't go anywhere because I want to welcome the guests. There you could argue the fact that the Eibishter included in this prophetic vision the interaction of Avram Avinu putting the Eibishter on hold to go get his guests, that he told the Eibishter to wait, that could work. That could be a proof, as the Gemara brought, to illustrate to us that Achnas Sorchim supersedes having the Shechina in your backyard. In which case, we're back to square one. Why doesn't the Rambam quote that pasuk? In addition to which, it's generally a very unusual and difficult way to try and explain the Rambam by commenting on Yad HaChazaka based on what he says in Moreh Nevuchim. Because the Rambam didn't mention the possibility that the whole Vayeira is one long prophetic experience as he does in Moreh Nevuchim. So why are you inserting a different genre of Judaism, albeit penned by the same rabbi, by the Rambam, into the genre of halacha? Now the ganze Parasha given as says nie given kein Dibur Meiser befeuil. Now the ganze Parasha is given by Moreh Nevuah. Yes, he says it in Moreh Nevuchim that the whole thing was a prophetic vision and never happened, but he doesn't even hint at that in the Yad HaChazaka. You cannot import the one into the other. Void Vika. Especially when you start to actually read what the Rambam says in Mishnah Torah, it's pretty clear that the Rambam is seeing it as a literal story, so you cannot cross over the Moreh Nevuchim and use that to answer a question on Yad HaChazaka, which means we're back to square one. Why doesn't the Rambam bring the same, more obvious proof from the pasuk about the priority of Achnas HaSorchim as the Gemara does? To get to understand that, let's look at what the Rambam taught in this section and how he taught it. So let's go back to the halachas in which he speaks about how important it is to host guests, and it's even more than the Shechina. Let's give the full picture over here. It's over two halachas. The first halacha he tells us is that you have a responsibility, it's a rabbinic responsibility to visit the sick, to accompany guests, and to help out with people when they need burial, etc. Dennoch in halacha beis, sagt the Rambam, in the following halacha, and as we well know, the Rambam does divide things into different halachas specifically. Then he says, Schar alvaya merubim min hakol, the reward for accompanying your guest out of your home supersedes all the rewards for the others. This is the statute that Avram Avinu engraved into the Jewish conscience, and it is the way of kindness that Avram Avinu followed. What did Avram Avinu do? He fed passers-by, or mashke oisan, he provided them with drinks, and he accompanied them. Then he says, that welcoming guests supersedes welcoming the Shechina. Shenemar quotes the pasuk as we've already brought, that there were three people that he saw. And then the Rambam says something most people don't really pay attention to, that accompanying, escorting your guests out is greater than welcoming them in. Amru Chachamim, to which the Chachamim say in Soita, any person who does not escort the guests, it is akin to, God forbid, the opposite of life, shedding blood. Now, we have to understand. Was looked at Rambam Balacha Aleph in the mitzvah Seshel Divrei Ulelavas Ha'orchim, und nicht B'loshen Hakel Hakol Achnos Ha'orchim. Why, when the Rambam is giving us the categories of behavior that a person is supposed to follow, does he talk about escorting rather than welcoming guests? Surely you first welcome guests. Surely achnasas orchim is the generic term for this process. Why focus on the escorting, which is on the way out? Pashas Lendman, as in der Halacha redt der Rambam wegen der Mitzvah Seshel Divreim, was verbunden mit Mitzvah Gemilas Chasodim Shebegufay. The easiest potential answer is to say, well, the Rambam is here talking about mitzvahs that you do with your own physical actions. In other words, levarkech cholim, you go visit the sick. Or lenacham avelim, you go and you comfort the bereaved. And he actually says these words. In that halacha, he says, this is the forms of kindness that a person does with his or her body that has no limits. Whereas when it comes to inviting guests, there it's providing food and drink. The primary way you fulfill this mitzvah is with budget. You pay for the food and the drink. It's not so much physical. You might even have other people doing the cooking, doing the serving. And those hotashir, that has limits. When the Rambam is in Pirush HaMishnayos and Pirush HaMishnayos, the Rambam goes into this, in the famous Elu Devarim that we say every single morning, it goes into the distinction between things that have no limits and things which are budgetary that have a limit. So maybe that's the reason why the Rambam said to escort your guests, because escorting you have to physically do. You've got to take those steps with them. But that's not good enough. And here's where we're going to find the hinge that helps us understand everything. In Halacha Beis the Rambam, as the Chek Shechokei Avram Avinu, in the second Halacha, the Rambam tells us that the statute Avram Avinu engraved in the Jewish conscience includes feeding and giving them to drink. And it's in that context that he tells us that hosting guests is greater than hosting the Shekhinah. So hang on a second. If the Rambam in this section is telling us about mitzvahs that a person does with their person, how are you back to speaking about feeding and giving them to drink, which you may not be doing with your person, and actually falls under the category of chesed that you do with your money? If, as we originally thought, the Rambam wanted to say, you know what's so special about escorting guests? Because you have to physically move with your guests. You've actually got to involve your body. Then he should have put that into this piece. He should have said something along these lines. This is the statute that Avraham Avinu instilled in the Jewish people. And that the kindness that he showed. And said that Avraham Avinu escorted his guests. Doesn't say that. He says, that you fed them. So he could have at least added that after he fed and gave them to drink, he accompanied, escorted them. Something's not adding up over here. You're telling me that the Rambam is focused here on mitzvahs that you have to do with your body. The only part of achnasas orchim that you have to do with your body is escorting your guest on the way out. Yet, when the Rambam talks about the mitzvah of achnasas orchim and how amazing it is, and it's the great thing of Avraham Avinu, he leaves out escorting. He should have said it. He should have inserted the concept of escorting over there, so we would know that the greatness of this mitzvah is, it is one of those mitzvahs that have no limitation because they involve your body. Rather, it's clear that the Rambam wants us to pay attention because it's relevant to know all of the factors that contribute to hosting guests, which is including the food and drink. Not only the escorting, even though escorting with your body and food and drink is not necessarily. Somehow food and drink is incorporated in the great big mitzvah of achnasas orchim. Question is how. So it would be really difficult to suggest that the only reason the Rambam includes all of these details to build up the case for escorting. If you think that's great, that when you escort them, it's greater than when you invited them in. Especially when you consider the quotation from the Gemara that he says, a person who does not escort his guest, it's as if he spilled, God forbid, blood. That illustrates the greatness of escorting already. You don't need to bring the food and drink just to build up the case for escorting. There's got to be something about food and drink in Achnasas Orchim that we're not understanding. Before we get there, something else needs to be explained. The Rambam started the conversation by telling us the reward for escorting your guests supersedes the reward for all of the other great things we've spoken about in this section. And then he says, but if you don't do it, it's God forbid like bloodshed. And the same kind of theme continues into the next piece, where the Rambam talks not about the individual, but about the Beis Din. Look what it says. The Beis Din had a responsibility to provide escorts, chaperones for people to travel from place to place. And if they were negligent about this, then the Torah considers it as if they had blood on their hands. The simple way to interpret this is the simple reason why no escort is equated with, God forbid, bloodshed is because if the person has a chaperone, you protect them, God forbid, from being attacked on the way. As, of course, the Gemara in Masechta Soita goes into detail with the Egla Rufa, etc. So the movement doesn't make sense. But bald, as Dr. seeing as the Rambam is making such a fuss about escorting your guests and that it's considered to be something so special, as behedor is kilo shefech damim, and if it's missing, it's akin to blood, to spilling blood. Why do you have to then tell me, and the reward for accompanying is greater than all the others? That's a side issue. The issue is if you neglect this, God forbid. And the principle is when you talk about a bigger quantum, you naturally include the smaller quantum. In other words, if you've told me that the absence of this behavior is bloodshed, you've told me it's really important. You don't have to say, and you'll be rewarded for it. To understand this, we have to consider that each of these items, but we're going to specifically focus on, it's all of Gemilas Chasadim, but we're going to specifically focus on Achnasas Orchim. There are two angles we could look at it from: the person doing the mitzvah and the recipient. There are two elements of Gemilas Chesed. Out of the nif'al von the mitzvah, there's the impact of the mitzvah. The impact is, here was somebody who lacked an element of their life. They needed a visit, they needed comfort, they needed assistance, and somebody filled that vacuum. So either you fill the vacuum, or you give something of value or something meaningful, helpful to the person who's the recipient. So from the recipient's perspective, they got something they didn't have or something that was valuable to them. The other side of the coin is the action of the person, the protagonist, the midas chesed, which is not just what they do, but also the characteristic, the attribute of their chesed that is now being exhibited. Let's make that more specific. These two sides apply to Achnasas Orchim also. If I look at it from the guest's perspective, then Achnasas Orchim is all, what does the guest get? He gets food, he gets drink, he gets a nice place to rest, etc. That's all a matter of the various specific actions taken by the host. More broadly, more broadly, you have the chesed being shared by the host. He's by showing the person that he's interested in him, giving him attention, etc. Two things. It's quite possible to be in a 5-star hotel and the manager doesn't even know who you are. You could be in somebody's home and they want to know your life, they want to care about you, etc. Two aspects of Achnasas Orchim. Bechlal is by Yonah Gemilas Chasadim Bechlal b'mitzvah v'nod mechaveiroi negea b'ika denifal. Now, generally speaking, anything under the category of Gemilas Chesed or any mitzvah between people, the primary element is, did the person get what they needed? Und die Midas HaChesed von dem Adam HaGemel Chesed und Gebike nicht zum Adam HaMekabel Chesed, not zum Gavra HaGemel Chesed. The state of being, the character, the love, the kindness, the emotional experience is primarily irrelevant to the recipient and primarily important for the practitioner. Bis man gefindt bei Tzedakah, as man arbeit selber mit euch Yodei und Motze Oni v'olach v'nis Parnas bo, is a Mekayim mitzvah Tzedakah. And this has a practical application. If a person drops money, and a poor person finds that money, the one who lost the money is not even aware of the fact that the poor person found the money and has yet fulfilled the mitzvah of tzedakah. Why? Because nifol. What had to happen, happened. The person needed tzedakah, he got the tzedakah. But when it comes to achnasas orchim, there's something more radical, revolutionary. As the experience of kindness, the goodness of the host, is relevant to the action, to the impact. It's relevant to what you're doing for the guest. So it's not just that the guest got his welcome pack and his hot meal and his comfortable bed. It's that the chesed of the host flowed through in those actions. The way Hachnasas Orchim should work is that whatever action the host takes, the guest should feel that is attention, that is care. Mitzad zayin regesh, that's something that the person feels. Avas Yisrael, the person loves the other person. Kimrumus Divrei Rambam, as Komitz say that in Bichlal after the Echakomoicha, the Rambam alludes to this when he says all of the mitzvahs under the Gemilas Chesed category are already part of after the Echakomoicha. The guest has to feel that. Where do you see that most clearly? In the fact that you have to escort your guest. Because escorting your guest is not fulfilling a need that he has while he's your guest. By definition, if you're escorting him, he's no longer your guest. Whereas feeding and giving him to drink, that's what he's your guest, is in your house. Obviously, you're going to do these things. Why do you escort the guest? Because you are in a state of chesed. Because even if we now no longer have a direct connection, the person's gone. The guest now feels the person cared about me. Look at this, he's even walking me, making sure I'm safe. I'm no longer his so-called responsibility. I'm no longer under his roof where he has to feed me, and he still cares about me. He cares about me, he's worried about my well-being, etc. That is the indicator of what Achnasas Orchim is supposed to be. Something that is experienced by the guest as kindness, not only experienced by the guest as things. On those is the Hemshech in Divrei Rambam. That's what the Rambam is telling us. The reward for escorting your guest supersedes everything else. And that is what Avraham Avinu instilled in the whole experience of Achnasas Orchim. In the feeding, in the giving them to drink, and in the escorting. In other words, the when the Rambam tells us that this is the great innovation that Avraham Avinu instilled in the Jewish people, he's not only saying that we also escort our guests. It's describing how the whole experience of hosting guests works. As Avraham Avinu hat eingestellt Achnasas Orchim beifun kozeh, as das soll enthalten nicht nur die meisten Nifel von Gemilas Chasadim zerachav shel oireach, noch die midas hachesed shebal habayis hameareach. The way that Avraham Avinu created Hachnasas Orchim is that the guest should not just feel looked after by the things provided by the host, but he should feel looked after by the host. He should feel the kindness of the host in that experience. Was das ist der derech hachesed shenag bo, as the Rambam emphasizes, it's a way of kindness that Avraham Avinu initiated. As levoyas ha'orchim kum zusammen mit dem, was Michael Oiverdorch mashke is on the fact that he escorts them is a continuation of how he feeds and gives them to drink. And that would explain how the Rambam then concludes on such a harsh note that if a person does not escort his guest, it is as if he, God forbid, spilled blood. It's this two sides of the same coin. The one side of the coin is that escorting your guest is like the ultimate, because that consolidates the entire experience of Achnasas Orchim. And the other side of the coin is neglecting to escort the guest is harmful. What does it mean harmful? The Rambam meint nicht nur as das can bring shvichas dmei hoerech bari chosed b'derech. The Rambam's not only telling us, like the Gemara Soita, that if a person doesn't have a chaperone, they are vulnerable to attack on the road, and therefore we have to look after them. But the Rambam is saying there's something much more subtle over here, and that is that feeling, and we all know that feeling, when somebody has done something begrudgingly for you, it's embarrassing. When the host does not escort the guest out, the guest feels, okay, he doesn't really care about me. He's not really interested in me. The action is there, but I don't feel the kindness in the action. So the whole experience of having been a guest now feels a little bit uncomfortable. As we know, when a person is embarrassed, they go pale, which is considered a form of shvichas damim. You make the blood, drain from their face. That is considered a subtle version of shvichas damim. He feels ashamed. My gosh, here I was a burden on these people. Shvichas damim, that's a form of shvichas damim. So this is not entirely different to tzedakah, which a person is supposed to give happily and with a smiling face. And the person giving the tzedakah should actually empathize with the difficulties of the recipient. Whereas the Rambam tells us that if a person gives tzedakah to a poor person with a dark face, and kind of looking down in the ground, the Rambam says the person loses their merit of tzedakah. The time was the Rambam tells us from and that would explain why when the Rambam introduces all of the things that a person is supposed to do for other people, he doesn't say welcome guests, he says escort guests. Because the escorting the guest captures what the essence of Achnas HaSorchim is. Care about your guest. Noch fällt die Levaya, demot fällt euch in der Mitzvah von Achnas HaSorchim in der Achille und Stier, was hat ihm gegeben Kanal. Not only is it that if you don't escort the guest, then that part of Achnas HaSorchim is missing, it's an illustration, or it exposes the fact that the whole investment of Achnas HaSorchim was not as it should have been. There wasn't as much chesed as the person should have put into it. But because sehr schlimmer, as das der time for was der Rambam bringt the mockery of Agdol Achnas HaSorchim, Magbolos Pnei Shechina, with all of this information, now we can finally appreciate why when the Rambam wanted a pasuk to prove to us that hosting guests is greater than hosting the Shechina, he chose which pasuk? From pasuk Vayeira in Shleisha Anoshim, the pasuk that he saw 3 people. He saw them. And it doesn't use the pasuk that the Gemara did, which shows that he put the Eibishter, so to speak, on hold. Why? Because the Rambam is telling us this information in context of halacha, that what is Achnas HaSorchim? Here, the whole context is to tell us that Achnas HaSorchim is this path that Avraham Avinu instilled in the Jewish people, a path of kindness. As an ikin Achnas HaSorchim is the mitzvah chesed shebozeh. He wants us to know that a core element of Achnas HaSorchim is that it should be with kindness, driven by kindness. The sanyos for simas leibtzon the morech, the paying attention to them, taking an interest in them. As das ist nicht nur bei diesem tut die meiste von Achnas HaSorchim, wenn ist Michael Evi durch Malachreise. Now, how do you know that you care about the guest? You can't test that in the time you're feeding them. Because feeding them might just be something you do. When do you test? Well, we've already seen that you test afterwards. If you escort them, now he's showing us you also test before ich lifnei. Take as soon as you see the people. As soon as he notices the guests, he starts to care about the guests. Vayeira, as soon as he sees them, he's immediately he's aroused to show them chesed. You see that in the pasuk that he saw, he noticed, and now he starts to care about the potential guests, not just the fact that he says, Eibishter, wait. As we mentioned right at the beginning of the Sikha, you're not supposed to look away, you're speaking to the Eibishter, nothing else should matter. And yet, where does he look? Where does he care? What's he inspired by? These people, to the extent that he tells the Eibishter to wait. With that in mind, This will help us solve another niggling issue, that how do you possibly learn about the greatness of Achnas Orchim from a story of, well, they weren't even people. Safe. It doesn't appear that Avraham Avinu really fulfilled the mitzvah of Achnas Orchim by feeding angels. Because because they weren't people. They didn't need the food. They don't need food. Especially according to the opinion, and Rashi quotes this opinion, that they didn't actually, they just gave the apparition of eating. And even according to the opinion that they actually ate and drank, is das need given der Fahr was sich genötigt in der Achilo stier. If they ate and drank, it's not because they were hungry, it's not because they needed hydration. Why did they eat or drink? Now, either because out of respect to Avraham Avinu, or according to the rule that says when you come to a place, you have to follow the behavior, the protocols of the place. So surely this is not real hosting of guests. How does this become the bar? How does this become the measure of what is considered hosting guests? And that it's greater than Akbalas Bnei Shechina. So it raises some questions. If it's true that Avraham Avinu was not really hosting guests because they didn't need his help, so how could, on what basis was Avraham Avinu allowed to interrupt his audience with the Eibishter? To do something that's not really Achnas Orchim? Is via Shaykh as Avraham Avinu so Khalil Nichshoven in Ibelozin Akbolos Pnei Shechina. It is unthinkable that Avraham Avinu would have put the Eibishter on pause to do something he didn't have to do. Number 2b is Kosher Loimar as Melentop Adin Emes. It's also far-fetched to suggest that we learn a halacha. Halacha is absolute truth. That welcoming guests is greater than hosting the Shechina. We're going to learn that from something that was not really Achnas Orchim. What is the whole Torah just that built on bubbles? Therefore, we have to conclude that even though the guests Avraham Avinu hosted only appeared to be human but were not, despite that, meaning despite the fact they did not need his help, they did not need his food, they did not need his drink, he still fulfilled the mitzvah of Achnas Orchim completely. How? Surely Achnas Orchim is about feeding empty stomachs. It's not only that it looked to Avraham as if he had fulfilled Achnas Orchim. No, he really, really did. How? The answer is based on everything that we've explained. The primary focus of Achnas Orchim is not so much in what the recipient gets. Do they get food? Do they get drink? The primary aspect of Achnas Orchim is showing kindness to the guest. As the Rambam says, it's the way of kindness that Avraham Avinu introduced. What does that mean? It means taking time, showing attention, taking an interest that the host does. It's the balabos showing interest in the guest. And the Maisa Gab of Simas Liba is the Achnas Orchim by Avraham Avinu given b'shleimus. From that perspective, Avraham Avinu did Achnas Orchim perfectly. He cared about his guests. He produced for them what he felt they needed. Not only that, the truth is, Achnas Orchim also has to benefit the guest, right? You can't just do things that you believe are good for your guests and in the meantime are completely off the mark. In this case, they benefited as well. Why? Because the primary objective of Achnas Orchim is that the guest should feel cared for and taken care of. And the Malachim had that. Especially because their mission required the Malachim to appear as humans. Therefore, for them to feel that they were welcomed, Avraham Avinu had to do human things for them. Over miyuchad, Especially when you consider who gave them this attention. It's Avraham Avinu, who is so cherished by the Eibishter. As it says in our parasha, that the Eibishter says, I know Avraham Avinu. What does it mean, I know? That is an expression of love. And generally speaking, Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov are vehicles of divine energy. The Malachim realize that Avraham Avinu is way greater than they are, and look, he's giving us time and attention. There's no question that Avraham Avinu gave to the Malachim, and they experienced from Avraham Avinu everything that Achnasas Orchim is about. Somebody so amazing has taken the time to care for me. Even the Malachim felt that. That is the core of Achnasas Orchim. Achnasas Orchim is not just about food and drink. It's about ensuring that the person who is your guest feels like the most unique, cared for human being possible.